Guys, welcome back to Convert. Cody and Jimmy here as always. Today we are talking about a pretty critical topic, I think, and that's when to cut a lead generation system. So Jim, obviously you've got a ton of experience in this game. You know, start me off by helping me understand why anyone would ever want to cut a lead generation system.
Well, the easiest way to make money in real estate is to sell stupid stuff to realtors. And so there's a ton of lead sources out there that promise the world and quite frankly just fail to deliver time and time and time again. And so for us, you know, we've been a little bit more susceptible to that in the beginning because we tried pretty much everything. And then what we did is we tried to scale into the ones that worked. So yeah, I mean, the reason we would cut it is because the lead source sucks. Whether the data sucks, the contact rate sucks, it was the clickbait or the, you know, kind of duping the consumer into giving their info, and they had no intention to ever do anything. So you really have to be cognizant of, you know, how is this data collected? What is the consumer seeing? As well as, is the data good? Are they actually going to pick up the phone? Are they actually interested? Things like that.
And so with that in mind, let's start at the outset, because you said something really interesting, and that's that, you know, it's not necessarily just about the dollars on the other side, but you know, it's about data, it's about the consumer experience. So, you know, why don't we start with what is your baseline for evaluating a lead conversion system? Let's start with one that you already have.
Okay. Yeah, so the way that I evaluate, let's say PPC, Google, Bing, those type of leads. When we first started out with Sync, that first year, our conversion was only 1%. Our ROI was great because we weren't buying many leads back then. Second year, it went up to 2%. And so the way I kind of look at stuff is the lower the quality of lead, meaning the length of time it takes from registration to close, the lower that percentage should be. So for a baseline, I usually use 2.5. We should usually be able to get 2.5% on low quality leads that first year because we're better at follow-up. The national average is closer to 1%. The higher that cost per closing, the quicker that turnaround should be, as well as ROI typically goes down because it's higher cost per closing.
Okay. So with a higher cost per closing in mind, you know, obviously, you know, you've talked about the return. How soon should they be getting a return, or what's the gap time between signing up and getting some leads to the point that you're saying, okay, we need to make a hard evaluation on this?
So again, like the higher the cost per lead, so Zillow, Realtor.com, referral services, I would say that time frame is 0 to 6 months, meaning they register, 6 months later is typically when they close. And so those lead sources, the more expensive it is, the more I watch it. And basically that's always been kind of my model is the more expensive it is, I'm going to evaluate it every 30, 60, 90, and then 180 days if it makes it through that. Typically though, a lot of those expensive ones sometimes don't even make it that far.
And so, you know, just so I want to drive this home for the viewers at home, you know, when you're talking about the Zillows, the Realtor.coms, you know, and you're evaluating them within 6 months, that's because they should be, by default, if they're using an experience like Zillow or Realtor.com, they should be ready to go right away. You know, they know kind of what they're looking at. They generally will come in on wanting more information about 123 Main Street or requesting a tour, you know, things like that. So there's that higher expectation that the fruit should be, you know, manifesting right away. And then for PPCs, where there's that longer time frame, you know, they're just beginning general searches, you know, houses in Fargo, you know, condos in West Fargo, things like that. There's a little bit longer time frame because they may just be kind of touching the water right now.
I mean, Zillow still has plenty of nurtures, but the way I look at Zillow is on the nurture type leads, our conversion on those, I believe, is 10%. On the Zillow Live transfers, our conversion is closer to 33%, meaning 33% of those we close from those. Overall, our Zillow is around 14% conversion because you have way more nurtures than live transfers. And so that's the way I kind of evaluate it is, okay, if this is a high quality lead source, you should be closing minimum 10%, maximum 30, 40%. You know, realistically 10 to 20% of those. Low quality type leads that are longer, national baseline is 1%. If it's below 1%, get out. Unless you're affording, going back to our other video, if you can afford to do a loss leader, if the data is good. Secondly, you know, the average for us has been closer to 4 or 5%. If you're above a 2.5, you're doing really, really well.
And so, I mean, it's easy to pick on or easy to use example like the PPCs and
And
Zillows.
let me put a caveat on that. Basically what I mean when I'm saying like 10%, 2.5%, meaning out of 100 leads that come into your system, two and a half will close this year. That'll, next year, probably another 1.5, and then the following year, probably another 1%.
Sure.
And same thing with the high quality. 10% of those will close minimum this year. Over the course of that, it's gonna be closer to 25, 30, 40%.
And so, I mean, with that in mind, let's, it's easy to pick on the Zillows and the PPCs because everybody's using them, everybody knows them. What about, these lead sources? Let's just say ABC Corporation has a third party, lead service. They connect with you, Jim. Let's start a broker to broker relationship because that is the number one thing they always say. How are you evaluating that, in the first couple weeks? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, the first couple of weeks, I want to see, okay, if they promise me 20 leads a week, how many leads am I getting? Secondly, out of those 20 leads, what's the date of validity? So on PPC leads, about 70% has some form of validator, either email or phone number. If they're below that 70%, you're basically paying for garbage. There are services that can go out and find it though. So those are kind of the big ones is what's the lead flow? What's the quality of the lead? And then, hey, do these people actually pick up the phone or respond to texts? And those are the three big ones. So I can say, okay, I was looking at this the other day with our Sierra leads. And I looked and said, okay, out of these 100 leads we got in the last 30 days, how many did we actually talk to? How many did we book appointments for? Are any contracted? And how much of it was junk? And that gave me a really good idea.
And so, we talked about the first couple weeks, like let's kind of block it off. What are the things 30, 60, 90, 120 days? If they're kind of continually passing, at what point do you know that this is a tier one lead source for us? We need to continue this relationship.
Yeah. Well, I would say if it's a slower registration to close type leads, that PPC, Google, Bing, things like that. If it's above a data quality of 60%, or if it's above a response rate 50%, then yeah, I'm gonna keep doing it. And literally I wanna see, okay, how many follow-ups were actually created out of there too? 100 leads, do we have 20 follow-ups, 30 follow-ups? Are they just complete garbage and they don't know how we got their phone numbers and we're pissed off, which happens a lot with certain lead sources, especially with Facebook. That's kind of how I look at it.
So I just want to drive that home one more time. I mean, even if that's 70 to 80%, response rate is telling you, dude, get out of here. I don't know how you got my number. You're still going to pursue from the response rate collectively.
Yeah, I mean, I'll still evaluate on the response rate. I mean, because it's kind of, it's a gut feeling, I guess. It's not one of those things I can equivocally say, this lead source is crap, this lead source is good. It's literally looking at it and say, okay, what's my ratio of the response rates, how many are in there? Because I know basically if I'm gonna have a 5% conversion rate over, let's say 4 years of this lead source, I know year one, I probably need to have 25 to 30% of those people being follow-ups. Because you look at all your ratios, we set an appointment, 50% chance to close sometimes. If they're contracted, on the sell side, it's 80% that you'll actually get paid, I believe. On the buy side, it's about 35%. If you contract 70% of people with a buyer agency rep, so then we just do the math backwards, right? Okay, how many do we need to get contracted? How many appointments do we need to set? How many leads do we need? And what's the ratio there?
Sure. And I mean, so obviously you have this relationship going forward. You hit a point where you say, okay, this is a tier one lead source. I think we're kind of privileged in the ability that we have the capital to spend to be able to experiment, on a lot of these different lead sources, but what would you tell the team that is, 5 people large and, kind of has to figure out, because it's easy for us to,
Right.
adjust our lead spend budget and kind of pivot and move based on what we're seeing and the trends that we're seeing both in the market and in the, the vendors themselves. But what about these smaller teams that, those 1 or 2 decisions could be critical, profit and loss decisions for them, if they go with the wrong lead source.
Right, and I would just do kind of a profit first model and say, okay, for every closing that comes into my brokerage, X% of that closing is going to go into the experimental fund. And say, okay, experimental fund maybe has $10,000 in a year. Let's try some stuff out, see what works. Because my market is drastically different than your market. I mean, we've had people come to our mastermind and rave about Realtor.com. Realtor.com in my market sucks. And so every market's going to be different, and you have to find out what's the right one. And so I get asked about lead sources I've never heard of before, and I'm always looking. If you can find me a lead source that does better than I'll do today, I'll buy it all. I don't care. But it's really hard to find good vendors.
Well, you bring that up, and it's interesting because I've seen that a lot at masterminds where people will come up and have conversations with us, and there's almost a brand equity to a lot of these third-party vendors where they go, what do you mean realtor leads suck? Because realtor leads are great for me, and then there's just this confusion that kind of leads us to believe that people really aren't truly evaluating the numbers the way that they need to be evaluated, or they're evaluating them incorrectly and they're going to get burned later on down the road when the market shifts in a post-COVID world. With that in mind, we look at these smaller teams who would be maybe a little more attracted to more the brand equity names, the Zillows, the Realtor.coms. We talked about developing a lead source strategy in the form of, hey, put some aside for the experimental stuff and then go with what you know and what works. What about when it's time to cut a lead source? If there were 3 boxes that need to be checked to say, you know what, it's time to cut this because this isn't working for us anymore. What are those boxes?
Can I afford to keep spending money that has no return, meaning is the data worth it? Secondly, how long have I given it? Is this been a 3-week thing, or is this been a 3-month thing? And third, I would just say, what's the validity of the conversation you're having? Like if I'm having, we had a lead source, I think it was like 2.5 years ago. It was supposed to be, they were promising, I think they were promising 400 leads a month. They were promising data of accuracy of 95%. And like the little spidey sense I had was like, this is BS, but I had a good referral from another ISA I knew that loved their leads. But each one is different in each geographic area. So I would say, is the data valid? Are the conversations good? Can I afford to keep doing this? That's really what I look at. And otherwise, the other thing I look at too is number 4, are the lead sources I have right now, can we scale more into those? Meaning, I can't scale anymore in Zillow. I'm pretty tapped out on it. I'm capped. I can't do anymore. But with Sierra, I just found out they just uncapped us, so I could toss another 10 grand a month in there if I want, because I know those quality of leads is good. I don't have to go shop for other lead sources. I have the ones I already need.
Sure. And so that's, I didn't have this in my notes, but I think that brings up a really good point is, for these smaller teams who may be capped out on the Zillows and maybe trying to figure out, and we always talk about in real estate kind of the tried and true methods of door knocking, of circle prospecting and things like that. But, if someone is looking to scale their lead converters, be that an ISA team or the individual agents, and they're capped out in Zillow and, they need to figure out how they're going to create a spending strategy that can outpace their competitors or maybe steal a little bit of market share, what would you recommend in that case?
Well, I'd recommend literally looking and doing SEO, because that's kind of our long-term strategy as well, is I want to get to the point where I don't have to buy leads because our SEO is so good. I mean, SEO is always going to be based on how much you're spending per month, but literally, what's your long-term play? Most realtors are thinking, what do I do for the next 3 months? They're not thinking, what's going to keep me number 1 for the next 10 years? And so really coming up with that strategy, that's what we've had to do, is say, okay, here's our strategy for the next 5 years. Here's how we're going to scale. Here's how we do it. We know what lead sources we need to. I told Cody the other day, I need another 34,000 leads next year. That's the number. So this year so far, 34,000 was the total. Need about another 20,000. So we literally have to go out and spend another 15 or 20 grand a month in order to get where we want to be. But most agents aren't looking at that. They're coming in, they're being like, where's my appointments? Where's my leads? Well, you have to have a strategy in order to acquire those leads.
And I think that brings up a really interesting point because, we've talked about it in our world, but, the answer can't just be more. When you're looking at, whether you're a rainmaker making, kind of the revenue targets for the company, I think we fall into, and real estate is a place where people fall really guilty and, well, what's the target? More. The target's always more. But if you don't have a number, how are you going to backwards plan? And I see that. And, people are not good in this industry at forward planning. They're not. And coming from, occupations where I was in project management and things like that, I can poke the holes in it. I can see it all day long. And I mean, that kind of explains a lot of the, fact that, this is a loss, a high loss industry. People aren't able to, stay the course for a long time.
Right.
And I think that has a lot to do with it. So, so kind of, we've gone through all the strategies. We've gone through how to make the decisions. What else are we missing here? When it comes to deciding when to cut a lead generation system.
Don't be afraid to ask others. That's one thing that I've really embraced too. Is I've reached out to other, directors of sales and ISAs and said, hey, this is my numbers. What do you guys think? Because a lot of times you might really like your rep, or there's other sorts of confirmation bias, and you want to make sure that that is a valid decision. So don't be afraid to reach out to others. And I do that all the time. We've done that with hiring. We've done it with firing. We've done it with a lot.
Absolutely. Well, that's all we got. When to cut a lead generation.
Always awkward. Always awkward.
I don't know. I never know how to end these things. So
yeah, we're just gonna smile.
Stay frosty.